One of the fascinating things about looking at music in its cultural context as a way of understanding what goes on in the culture is that there are so many parameters, so many variables. Uh, the thing that comes closest to mind is a quick parallel is perhaps foodways, the way people, different cultures adapt and borrow from each other, but really adapt both in terms of what's available locally, what's good locally, and what's good at different times, and then try to imitate things that they learn from others and then adopt those as well. Same thing happens with music. And there are so many fascinating stories of how that happens. And it has always seemed to me that, unfortunately, music gets neglected as a potential key for understanding how humans absorb and trade ideas and change things. And oftentimes you find some interesting and fascinating stories. And this is one that's intrigued me for a long, long time, and I think it's very little known. It concerns, I want to focus in this discussion on the use of stringed instruments, particularly zithers, in the Far East. What is a zither? It's another kind of stringed instrument. A harp is one kind. A lute is another. A guitar, violin are both lutes. They're long-necked instruments, either bowed or plucked. A zither is a board, usually hollow, with strings stretched across the surface. It can have bridges or not. Bridges, that is, that would individually raise the strings up the surface, off the surface, and alter the pitch. The bridges can be moved one way or the other. Closer to the plucking side makes the string shorter and the note higher, and further the other way away from the bridge makes the string lower. Very widespread, particularly in Asia, and they're considered almost natural instruments closely associated with the cultures of Asia, China, Korea, and Japan. Vietnam and Okinawa and Mongolia as well. They all have these instruments. There are similar instruments in other parts of the world, but what fascinates me is how all these instruments came to be what they are. Let's begin with the puzzle that intrigued me. Two of the most ancient and highly respected Chinese stringed instruments are those two that are used in the ancient ritual orchestra, the so-called Confucian orchestra. These are the qin and se. The se is a 25-string zither with individual bridges under each string. The qin is today a 7-string zither with no bridges at all, and it's fingered directly on the fingerboard, much like a violin. Okay, what's fascinating about these two instruments is that when they're written in Chinese, the words qin and se have at the top of their character what's known as either the jade radical or the king radical. The implication, one might suppose, is that it's a precious thing, a valued thing. But also the very strange and unusual and foreign instrument, the pipa, is also written with the jade radical on top. The characters underneath, of course, give the sound for the words. And the pipa is, of course, a Persian instrument, originally the Persian barbat that traveled both west and became the lute, and eastward and became the Chinese pipa, and eventually the Japanese and Japanese biwa and the Korean pipa. But that's another story. What is intriguing is that all these instruments are written with the jade radical or the king radical, and yet the very common plucked zither of China, Korea, and Japan is called Koto in Japan, Kayagum in Korea, and Cheng or Zong in China, is written with the bamboo radical. That is, the character for bamboo is at the top of the name for this instrument. Now, of course, in Japan, I don't think that holds true in China, but in Japan, sometimes people will use the character for chin or kin to refer to the koto, but actually the correct character should be saw with the bamboo radical on top. And it's used that way certainly in China. So why is that? What does this have to do with bamboo? Well, here's where the history gets very interesting. Evidently, the original instrument was a tube zither made of bamboo. And these tube zithers are still scattered all over Asia, particularly Southeast Asia. They're still used amongst the hill peoples of the Philippines in the north, in various places in Indonesia. A very highly developed and beautiful one is found all the way in the eastern part of Indonesia on the island of Timor, or actually in Roti, south of Timor. A number of tube zithers and partial tube zithers and bamboo gongs, which are actually tube zithers gently struck to give the soft sound of a gong, but made of bamboo. These are found all over Southeast Asia. The Hmong people of Southeast Asia, the hills of Vietnam and Cambodia, and all of these places have tube zithers. Many tube zithers found, for example, in the Philippines, in the southern islands, in Palawan. These were quite widespread. Now, if you read the Chinese histories, the Chinese always take credit for everything, and their histories will say that they invented this instrument. But in fact, it seems to have been a native instrument to Southeast Asia, where very thick, big bamboo grows. And what they would do with these tube zithers is cut a small strip from the surface of the bamboo, and then force a little wedge of bamboo under that, and make it raise, increase the tension, and then they would pluck that. There are some beautiful examples. The kolibit of the northern Philippines. The Timor sasando from the island of Timor now has metal strings fixed onto it because the bamboo keeps breaking, but it's the same original zither. Some beautiful examples from Palawan, from Mindanao as well. And because the peoples of the island of Malagasy were originally had Malay connections or Malay culture there, the original Malay sailor sailed across and brought the tube zither to Malagasy, and it's now virtually a national instrument, the vali. Spelled Vali-ha, but pronounced Vali in Malagasy. And it has taken many forms as a folk instrument, and then also it's now used in modern Malagasy ensembles playing the new Malagasy popular music. It's become a national instrument. So this is the tube zither roots. Now, what happens in China is that this instrument becomes adapted. It very soon is no longer made of bamboo. It's interesting that the southern Chinese type of zheng, the 12-string zheng, and its Vietnamese counterpart, the Dan Tran, still retain a strong curve on the surface of the instrument. And it looks, particularly the Vietnamese one, still looks like you could almost imagine it was a half tube of a large tube of bamboo with strings stretched across it. It's, of course, no longer made of bamboo, but the character bamboo is still there, and so that indicates a knowledge of it. That's the background. That's where the instrument came from. Then it falls into the hands of musicians in China, and from there, from the Chinese court, it spreads to Korea and Japan, where it is first used in the court orchestras of Korea and Japan, and eventually disseminates and is used in the folk cultures of Korea and Japan. There's a couple of interesting anomalies, and these are the outliers. One is a very ancient Japanese zither called the wagon, which is made of wood, and then it has natural maple twigs to serve as bridges. They're natural and they tend to fall very often. You have to place them very carefully. It has a very different playing technique, and in fact seems to relate a little bit to the playing of the Ainu tonkori. The wagon in Japan is only used for the ancient Shinto ritual music, but apparently it was very widespread. This instrument seems to be, and the tonkori seem to be, brought over from mainland Asia before the popularity of the Cheng, the one with the bamboo radical. The Cheng or Kayagum in Korea or Koto in Japan really come in with the court and then spread. But it's interesting how they each spread differently. If, for example, the chin, the ancient 7-string chin, used to have 5 strings and at one point had bridges. Nobody has ever seen it played with bridges. That was gone hundreds of years ago. It's now fingered like a violin directly on the fingerboard. That developed long after these other instruments were introduced, but developed in a very, very special, unique way. Its playing technique is very special, both plucking the strings with the left hand. Each of the strings is a different thickness, and then plucking with the right hand and fingering with the left hand, but in many different forms of vibrato, and making the different sounds according to the thickness of the strings. It's a very rich, colorful instrument. One of the most beautiful Chinese forms of playing the zheng is the Cantonese style. I have an old recording, probably from the late 1940s, that I found in Chinatown in San Francisco. I'm very proud of it because it's the name of the piece is The Sound of Night Rain on the Bamboo Leaves, and it's supposed to represent the plucking of the string. Sounds like the rain hitting the bamboo leaves, but the player is using brass strings and is using a lot of very delicate ornamentation. It's clear that from the tone, the intonation, and the way of inflecting the melody is clearly influenced by the spoken Cantonese language. I think the player has to be a Cantonese speaker to play like this. I don't think a Northerner could really imitate it well. In northern China, they continue to play different styles in different regions of China. But it's interesting that in the court in Korea, we have no idea what the court music of how the court music of China sounded, but in Japan and Korea, the 12-string zither survives in the court. It's a 13-string zither, the koto in Japan, and 12-string Kayagum in Korea. But what's really interesting is the way this instrument goes out into the world outside the court. The Kayagum now has 12 strings, but each of the strings is of a different thickness. And so that's unlike the Cheng in China, as most of the ones that we know about. It's certainly unlike the koto in Japan. It has a soft, very easily inflected tone, and as a consequence, the music can be very, very complicated, a very complicated use of the left hand to produce ornaments, and very complicated techniques for plucking with the right hand. By contrast, in Japan, both Japan and Okinawa use the koto. The older recordings indicate a looser style of playing. Here's an example of Okinawan style of playing the koto, a rather loose and highly inflected style. Here's an example of old, from the 1930s, Japanese style of playing the koto, which is very much unlike the modern contemporary style of playing koto. The strings are much looser and the ornamentation of the left hand is very pronounced. Modern-day koto in Japan emphasizes sharp, clear, brittle strings and much more precision and much less inflection of the strings with the left hand. There is some, but it's become more brilliant and more oriented toward the stage. there's a very unique style of playing this instrument amongst the Mongolians. They have an instrument called the yatag, which is also a variant of this same Cheng. And unfortunately, recently the Mongolian yatag playing has been more sinified. They're playing more in the Chinese style, and the old style of playing in the Mongolian style has just about disappeared. But here's a recorded example from many years ago of the Mongolian style of playing the yatag. So here is a look at how this idea that was originally a tube zither, a simple tube zither from Southeast Asia, how it developed, and in the context of these various cultures turns into a very different kind of musical instrument. So what's interesting is that in each of these cultures they developed from an original idea that was introduced and mostly developed in China from the old tube zither, but then spread to each of these cultures: Vietnam, various regions of China, Mongolia, Japan and Korea, and in each of those areas it adapted itself to the needs and tastes of the local culture. Fascinating example of the ingenuity and inventiveness of humans all over the world.